I am Jim Henderson, and I'm president of the University of Louisiana System. The official naming for that position was October 6th, a year ago. So it's been a full year since I've known about the job, but I've only been responsible for it since January. So it gives me a little plausible deniability. It hadn't been quite a year, but it has been quite a year for us. Our system has 9 universities. They range from 2 universities at University of Louisiana Lafayette and University of New Orleans, 2 Research 3 universities at Louisiana Tech and Ruston and ULM in Monroe. We have one of the nation's most historically rich HBCUs at Grambling State. We have McNeese State, which is in the hotbed of economic development in the state of Louisiana and some would argue the entire South. We have Nicholls State University, which is right in the middle of a search for a new president down the Bayou region of Louisiana. Southeastern University, Louisiana University on the North Shore. And of course, the site of the oldest permanent site dedicated to higher education in Louisiana, and my alma mater, Northwestern State. These universities, each is unique, has its unique history, its unique traditions, and yet they share this common goal of elevating our populace through education. It is this fall we celebrate 91,501 students enrolled across the state. That includes record highs at Louisiana Tech, its highest enrollment since it opened its doors in 1894, and a record high at Northwestern State, which opened its doors in 1884. So we're excited about the growth that we're seeing, and as we start to think about the reasons we have that growth, I think they're very simple. It's the economy. And the changes in the 21st century economy and its demand for an ever-increasing skill set. You know, in 2007, we unveiled this new product. We didn't unveil it, I wish we had, but someone unveiled this product called the iPhone. And you think about how our world has changed in the 10 years since this phone was released. When I was a student at Northwestern State in student media, we got a great infusion of resources and we were able to buy the latest computing equipment. We had the Macintosh Quadra 950, which was an extraordinary piece of design computing. And the tower was probably 2 feet tall and it was probably 8 inches wide. And it was about 1/250,000th of the computing power of this phone connected to this watch. Technology is changing at such a rapid pace, and it's only going to continue to change. Now, a lot of people get scared when it comes to change. And it is frightening. When the cotton gin was first introduced to the public, we talked about the jobs that were going to be lost because of these advances in technologies and these advances in automation. And nothing has changed. Today, as we see automation become ubiquitous, as we see robotics being used in manufacturing, as we see the advances in artificial intelligence, people are afraid about the future. But I'm not. I'm very bullish about the future because I know that the answer to these advances in technology is just increasing education. We know that just here recently, since the end of the last recession, we have created about 2.9 million new jobs, good jobs in the United States. 2.8 million of those jobs have gone to those with bachelor's degrees. A new statistic from Georgetown just came out that said by the year 2020, now remember, we're 80 days from 2018, so 2020 is not that far in the distance, that 47% of all jobs filled in the country will be occupied by those with a college degree, an associate degree or a bachelor's degree or higher. 47%. That's a dramatic change from where we've been before. In 1990, about 40% of good jobs required a college degree. In 2015, 55% of the good jobs filled, and those are jobs that are full-time, those are jobs that offer health care benefits, that offer retirement benefits, that pay a living wage. 55% of those jobs are filled with those with bachelor's degrees. That market force is the greatest force that's driving enrollment at our universities. And we're excited about what that's leading. Now, this would not be a higher education conversation if I didn't complain a little bit about funding. I know that that's what we do, and for good reason. And I want to put a little bit different spin on that if I can, though. You see, in Louisiana, of the 16 states in the Southern Region Education Board region, We operate on less resources per student than every other state. $1,500 less per student than the schools in Florida, about $2,400 less per student than the schools in Texas, and you can compare us to state after state after state. That's total resources. That's resources that come from the state, and that's resources that come in the form of tuition and fees. Now, this last legislative session, for the first time in a decade, higher education institutions were held steady in terms of state funding, and TOPS was fully funded. Again, it's the first time that has happened in almost a decade, and the level of stability that that provided our universities and their ability to serve students, to remunerate faculty, to plan for the future cannot be overstated. Tremendous value to our universities. And it was in that context that we brought the 9 presidents of our universities to Baton Rouge for a day-and-a-half planning session to say, gentlemen, how do we talk about preparing our system for this 21st century economy, for this new reality? Now, our system has a tremendous economic impact. We have a direct economic impact on the state of about $4 billion a year. Our graduates from the last decade have earned $6.5 billion in new and increased salaries. So we know that our impact is quite strong. We decided to challenge ourselves, and we said, if we're going to prepare our citizenry for a future that is dependent upon talent, that has been developed at a higher level than ever before, how are we going to approach that? We looked at some statistics in Louisiana. We know that depending on the measure, we rank anywhere from 46th to 49th in educational attainment. That's people with an associate degree or higher. We know that we have, I think Wilson Tell tweeted an article the other day that said that we have 300,000 students, or excuse me, children, potential students, eventually students, under the age of 5, and a third of them live in poverty. We know that we have a state that has had the largest percentage of first-generation students that come to school in the last decade. And when you put all these things together, it says we have to have a purpose for our system that cuts across these individual institutional cultures and traditions and histories, and says collectively, we're going to make a change in the way that we do business. And so these 9 presidents were divided into 3 groups, and they led a conversation I think that is going to bear fruit for us. We decided that by the year 2025, we were going to produce 150,000 new graduates from the University of Louisiana. That means that we will produce the most educated generation in Louisiana's history. And by producing this generation, it means that we can start to put an end to this cycle of incarceration, this cycle of living on state support, this cycle of poverty that continues to plague our state. Now, that's a great number to put out there, and it's a great aspiration to try to aspire to. But at the same time, we know that if we're going to do that, we have to reach down to populations that have been neglected for many, many years. We know that first-generation students require a level of service that probably is not applicable to students that come from a long lineage of higher education. We know that we're going to have to reach adults. There's 1.5 million adults in the state of Louisiana that are in the workplace but yet lack a post-secondary degree. So in addition to just graduating more students, we're going to have to reach new populations that we've never reached before. That's how you change this cycle that we've been in. That's how you become competitive with the state of Texas and with the state of Alabama and the state of Mississippi and the state of Arkansas. And that's how you become competitive on a national level. So we know that access is going to be important. We know that increased levels of success for our students is important. We also know that we're going to have to reach partnerships that we've done a great job of in the past. We're going to have to bring those to scale. Developing these public-private partnerships will be absolutely essential to our future. And you can point to examples of that exist across the state. If you go to the northwest corner of Louisiana and you see CSRA right there in the Cyber Research Park in Bossier City. Now, CSRA was just recently named the #1 provider of government contracts to the federal government, and it has a tremendous investment in Northwest Louisiana. But it didn't just happen by chance. It happened because Louisiana Tech University and Bossier Parish Community College and Northwestern State came together in a partnership that said we are going to quadruple the number of graduates we produce in computer information systems and computer science. When you go to CSRA right now, you'll see in their lobby quite often faculty from those three institutions sitting at tables with some of the leading professionals in the IT world, developing curriculum, developing pathways for students to move into employment. You'll see students sitting at those tables, moving into practice-based learning, moving into internships. It is an extraordinary success story for the state of Louisiana. And you can go across the state and you can name these examples. Just to look at the partnership between ULM and CenturyLink, or CGI at UL Lafayette, and on and on. In fact, I left New Orleans about 30 minutes too late, but about an hour before I was supposed to speak here today, talking with economic development professionals about how we can strategize and bring these types of economic investment into the city of New Orleans. It's a wonderful partnership that exists between our economic development professionals and our schools. We also have to take advantage of our research components. And there's great examples of research that extend across our system. At ULM, they recently announced the connection between olive oil and the prevention of dementia and Alzheimer's. And if you love olive oil like I do, that's a great thing to hear. One that was less attractive to me, but still just as innovative, is at McNeese, when they uncovered a link between alligator blood, and alligator blood can serve as a very strong antibiotic. Now, next flu season, I don't expect you to be drinking alligator blood, but at least that science is something that can be drawn upon as we continue to develop new interventions for these types of ailments that we have. And so this research is absolutely vital. My son is a freshman at University of Louisiana Lafayette this fall. Now, he could have gone anywhere he wanted to in the country. In fact, he was inundated with advertisements and recruitment materials from some of the finest universities around the country, and also state universities that are surrounding states that think that Louisiana's best and brightest are there for the pickings. But he's at University of Louisiana Lafayette, and he's using a particle accelerator to fire some kind of thing at monkey neurons. I have no idea what it even means. I was a journalism major, like many of you. We can write about it, but to explain it is a little bit difficult. But then I found out that this particle accelerator is one of 4 that exist in the country. And when you combine that with the massive supercomputing and data analytics capabilities at ULL, he is in a research utopia. Freshman, physics student. That's the kind of innovations that are going to lead us to developing this new world-class talent. Now, inevitably, when you talk about higher education in Louisiana, you start hearing about efficiencies. And we understand that we are stewards of taxpayer resources. Now, 10 years ago, the taxpayer funded about 70% of our operation. Today, the taxpayer funds about 18% of our operation. If you start thinking about what that means, we get about $214 million in our system in direct state support of our institutions. We send $90 million of that back to fund unfunded accrued liabilities. So $90 million of 214 goes to UAL. We are operating these institutions as self-supporting mechanisms. And so being efficient is not just something that we do because we're stewards of funds, it's because it's something we have to do as a daily business practice. And so it's not about being more efficient, it's about ensuring that we're using the resources that we have to drive our outputs. And sometimes people don't like us to talk about these business terms. You know, when I talk about the low state resources that we have per student, or total resources we have per student, I call that a low unit cost of production. And sometimes when I talk about that in front of faculty, you get this response that's like, man, that seems so sterile. And it is sterile because you've just squeezed the humanity out of the term. And so when you think that those units are students, when you think that unit cost is our investment in their future and in our future, you realize why that language doesn't resonate well. All right. So we've got to continue to be more efficient, but as we realize these opportunities to be administratively more efficient, we've got to take those resources and reinvest them back into the classroom so that we're providing our students not only access to education, but we're providing them access to world-class education, the highest levels of education that's going to prepare them for this 21st century. And also when you talk about being stewards of resources, you have to look at what is our number one asset? What is our greatest resource? And our greatest resource is our faculty. There is no closer connection we have to the student than the faculty member that stands in front of the class. The answer to retention is the faculty member. The answer to innovation is the faculty member. The answer to delivering education in new ways and new methods to reach students that we've neglected for many decades is the faculty member. And so if we're going to be good stewards of the resources, that means we've got to continue to recruit, to nurture, and retain the absolute best faculty that we have across the country. It's going to be one of our keys for our success. We are in an uncertain age. You hear Elon Musk talk about the need to move to this model where we provide UBI, Universal Basic Income. And the argument is because technology is advancing so quickly, we're going to lose jobs. We're going to lose employment opportunities for our citizenry. And that the only solution is for the state to step in and provide the subsistence wage to all of its populace so that they can continue to just live. I subscribe to a different vision. We know historically in the United States, every time we have reached a new advance in technology, it's actually resulted in the creation of new jobs. You know, for a long time in manufacturing went to nations where the labor was the cheapest. But today, because of automation and because the manufacturing workers are having to think critically and solve problems, work as teams and communicate effectively with each other, you're starting to see a resurgence in manufacturing employment across the United States because of a skilled workforce, because of automation. They're looking for talent that's been developed. So I don't subscribe to the UBI notion. I know that Louisiana and the United States can be more competitive if we develop talent that is ready for an era of uncertainty, an era of rapid change, an era that is full of uncertainty as any we've ever seen. That excites me. And it excites me because I know that we have these 9 institutions that work collaboratively with the LSU system, with the Southern system, and with our friends at Louisiana's community and technical colleges that serve over 250,000 students across this state. That if we redouble our efforts, if we focus on the mission that we have before us, and if we can find a way to create a policy environment that's conducive to creating this talent, then we will realize a Louisiana that's escaped generations before us. So that's my message. That's one that I think that is the vision for Louisiana's universities that will help us become even more meaningful in the future. As we build on this illustrious past, I'm very bullish about the future for higher education. And with that, would love to open the floor for questions. The question was about the state budget in Louisiana, how it's going to be static at best and probably decreasing in terms of availability of revenues, and how are we going to create the facilities to serve to produce 150,000 new graduates by 2025. Well, part of it is looking at innovations in higher ed, and one of them is just the use of technology. See, higher ed is not just bricks and mortar anymore. It's about using technology to deliver education to the end user. We have a number of schools that have invested a lot in online education, and I'll be honest with you, it is not the panacea. Quite often people talk about that it's the latest fad in higher education is going to transform the way we deliver the entire business model. That's never going to happen. You're always going to have an 18-year-old that wants to come to a campus, live in a dorm, participate in the college life like most of us did. But technology does enable us to do things a little bit differently. I used to teach a class at Northwestern State that met on Monday evenings for 1 hour. And the rest of the time it was delivered in hybrid instruction, using technology to deliver the knowledge. And then when we'd meet in the classroom, it was all about taking that knowledge and developing understanding. Well, that was a facility that historically would have been used for 1 hour, 3 days a week, and unavailable. Well, just think, we just tripled the effective use of that space because someone else could meet in there that same hour the next night, and the next night, and the next night. So there's ways to use technology to do that. There's also ways to use partners. When you look at some of our community colleges, that are across the state with technical campuses at about 42 different locations. There's nothing that says that room that's really just concrete and mortar has to be used to deliver the instruction that it's always been used for. So why can't we take a higher ed leadership class and offer it at a technical college campus? And why can't a technical college come on a four-year university campus and offer some of their instruction? Utilizing that space a little bit better is one of the best places we can find some efficiencies, and that's how you scale up and deliver that 150,000 students. So the question is, looking at a chart that we provided with our strategic framework, comparing Louisiana to Alabama, for instance, and that Alabama spends about $17,000 per full-time student, and Louisiana it's $12,000 per full-time student. And how are we ever going to compete? Well, that's a great question. And to me, that's a call for reinvestment in Louisiana. The questioner also asked, was talking about one of the greatest investments we've made in the history of the federal government in the GI Bill, and how for $2 billion we've produced $16 billion in income for veterans. I think that you've just answered your own question, is that in Louisiana, we've got to decide that our priority is going to be developing our own citizenry so that they can be competitive in the 21st century, that the return on that investment is more than worth the investment. When you look at our schools right now, we have a $12 to $1 return on investment. For every dollar in state resources we get, we deliver $12 back to the economy, and that's direct economic impact. If any investor in this room does not take a $12 to $1 return on investment, I understand why we're journalists and we're not certified financial planners, right? It's a no-brainer. Unfortunately, in Louisiana, we get so caught up in what I answered on the previous question, in these measures of inputs. Instead of talking about outcomes and talking about returns on investments, we talk about cost. And we talk about cost in a way that works really well on Facebook and Twitter, but it escapes this fundamental understanding that the fact that if you invest in your people, the return on that investment is more than worth the cost. Unit cost of production is the lowest in Louisiana as it is in the South, but those units are student, and the cost is our investment in our entire future for all of us. If we're going to be competitive with Alabama and Mississippi and Texas and Georgia and Tennessee, we've got to find an answer to that question. How do we invest more in the development of our people? Yeah. Again, the question is about the chart and about the resources per student. I will tell you that the letters that my son got from the University of Alabama and from Auburn and from Alabama Birmingham filled up our mailbox. Now, he was a student that had a very high ACT score, had a lot of AP classes. He was the kind of student that states want to come to their state because they think if they get their arms around them, they're going to stay. And he's worthy of their investment. The reason that Alabama is able to go after him is because of that disparity in resources per student.
Define resources.
Yeah, resources per student is just how much money does the university have to operate divided by the number of students that it serves. It includes state support, and it includes tuition and fees from the student. It comes from the Southern Region Education Board. Alabama spends about $110 more per capita in state support of higher education than we do in Louisiana. And it's about priorities. It's just prioritizing your investment. Think about from the year 2009 to the year 2015, we reduced state spending in Louisiana, state general fund expenditures, by about $689 million. $753 million of that came from higher education. And those numbers are not transposed. $689 million in total reduction in state support, $753 million from higher education. We've got to do a better job as higher ed professionals delivering the message about the value of higher education, and that's what elevates their priorities. The question was that in the last round of budget cuts, there was a question raised if we could delay payments on UAL so that we wouldn't suffer the severe cuts to higher education. I think that's something that comes up from time to time. I'll be honest, I don't think it's smart business because the UAL is going to continue to grow. I think they've had a great year in terms of their investments. At least the email I got from TRSL suggested that. I think that is a situation that's been created for generations that has to be addressed. I think the plan they have to address it is smart. But I will offer this to you, that if a university is paying for the UAL, right? If that university ceased to exist, the obligation associated with that UAL doesn't disappear. So if you close the doors on an institution, you still have to pay that unfunded accrued liability. I do think that there's some opportunities for the state to explore taking those UAL obligations off of the books of institutions because it's a state obligation. And that could do some things budgetarily that would make a lot of sense, do some things creditworthiness for our institutions. That's way above my pay scale in terms of of understanding the finances associated with that, but it just seems odd to me that a state obligation is kept on the books of our colleges and universities. Yes. Again, the question is related to the chart about total resources available per student. And it's important to understand that those resources come from two sources. They come from the state in the form of state support, and they come from the student in terms of tuition and fees. So, for instance, Louisiana ranks 16th out of the 16 southern states in total resources per student, but we rank 15th in state resources per student, and we rank 7th in tuition and fees per student. So there's that mix that's in place there. And the question was, should people talk to their legislators about that? I think that people should understand that we have not prioritized higher education in Louisiana's budget for quite some time. We talk about in 2008, we finally reached the Southern Region Education Board average, but that's not really true. Because in 2008, we reached the SREB average in total resources per student, in state support per student, but the average was based on the year before. So we reached the prior year's average, while every other state continued to invest more in higher education. Since 2010, Florida has increased their state support for higher education by $1 billion. And I love the Florida comparison, but nobody compares my favorite measure of Florida. In 1960, Florida and Louisiana both had 8 members of the House of Representatives in Congress, which is, of course, determined by your population size. Today, Louisiana has 6, Florida has 27. If we want to compare ourselves to Florida, I think we look at Florida and say, what has Florida done holistically to drive growth in their economy, to drive growth in their population? And that's the comparison. When we compare ourselves to Texas, we got to understand that there are as many institutions within 150 miles of downtown Houston, more than there are in Louisiana. You know, that's the comparisons that we need to make. And so if we can convince our populace that investments in higher education are essential to our competitiveness, to their competitiveness, if we can ensure them that workforce development and economic development and community development are dependent on human development, that's when we can get the message across. Our problem, though, is a lot of times facts don't change opinions. In fact, there's a number of stories out there that say facts don't change opinions. And when you have people that come from a state that has historically underperformed in educational attainment, it can be hard sometimes to impress upon the gentleman on the street that a college education is absolutely essential. But the students are starting to get it. I think that's why you're seeing the increase in enrollment, and I think that message will go forward into our legislature. It's a great question. The question was, if we don't see a shift in state funding and state support for higher education that actually gives us the resources to be competitive with these states, what are 2 of the priorities, or what are 2 things that our universities could do to try to level that field? And I'll tell you an answer to both. One is the policy environment. So we've still got a policy environment for higher education that is focused on inputs. We don't have a vision for what educational attainment can mean for Louisiana. That's when you compare us to Tennessee, where they have the drive to 55. They want 55% of their adult population to have a post-secondary credential by the year 25. In Texas, it's 60 by 30. 60% of their adult population having a post-secondary credential by the year 2030. I will tell you, because it's one of my closest friends who left Louisiana and is now in Alabama. Alabama is developing their vision for higher educational attainment. If we, as a higher ed enterprise in Louisiana, would cease our focus on small, in my opinion, meaningless inputs, and instead focused on that outcome and put a vision out there, I think you would start to see the population and the legislature start to rally behind that vision. So the policy environment would be number 1. Number 2 is something that plan represents, and it's something that's already in place, is having our system work more systemically. You know, universities of Louisiana are 9 distinct universities with a rich culture, a rich history, but when you bring them together and you start focusing on this total resource supply that we have, and talk about how systemically we can better target those resources to deliver those kinds of outcomes, that's when you produce more taxpayers. That's when you produce fewer incarcerated people, fewer people that are dependent on state support. You start to generate revenues, and that's going to take care of the state budget piece. Now, getting people to recognize that will be the difficult part, but we know that by delivering on that product, it won't be that we're doing more with less. We'll actually be establishing a case for reinvestment, and that reinvestment is going to be critical. The question is about the structure. Yeah. So the question is about really the structure of higher education in Louisiana, and we have 5 key entities involved. You have the Board of Regents, which is the coordinating board that establishes higher education policy in the state. Its chief constitutional charge is to develop a master plan for higher education, and that's where that vision for educational attainment really should come from. It also has to develop a funding formula, and the Constitution is a little bit vague, but that funding formula says that it should ensure at minimum an equitable distribution of funds. And so that's where the budget request comes for higher education. And then our colleges and universities are managed in 4 systems. You have the flagship system, the land-grant flagship University of Louisiana, which is LSU, and its Ag Center and its healthcare component, that is a distinct entity. And then you have the land-grant HBCU system. That's the Southern University system with its ag mission and all the things that Southern comprises. Together, they serve about 45,000 to 50,000 students. And then you have 2 systems that are truly statewide in their delivery of education. That's the community and technical colleges that serve about 66,000 traditional 4-credit students. They serve probably another 70,000 non-credit students or adult basic education students through their network of 13 colleges that have about 50 locations around the state. So they're managed as a community and technical college enterprise. And then the University of Louisiana system that has the 9 regional universities that serve their communities. And so that's how higher ed is managed in Louisiana. A lot of people ask, is that the right structure? And again, I think it's just the wrong question to ask, because no state has figured out the structure, and every state focuses on restructuring. And the reason you focus on restructuring is because you distract people from the actual business of the universities. Instead, we ought to hold these systems, my system, hold our universities and our colleges accountable to the outcomes that they produce, the number of graduates, the performance of those graduates when they enter the workforce. That's the focus. Structure to me is just a red herring that's out there. The question was about serving adult students and whether when TOPS emerged as a tremendous funding source for students, if that shift to TOPS made us focus less on serving adults. I will tell you that we're serving fewer adults as a percentage of our population than we did 10 or 15 years ago. And I do think there's a TOPS relationship to that, but I think it's a little more nuanced and complex than that. It's really about the tuition swap that occurred in the last 10 years. When the legislature authorized an increase in tuition, and then whatever revenue, the gross revenue that increase in tuition would generate, that's the amount of state resources that were reduced from our colleges and universities. And so the idea is, optically, you have a sustained, constant level of total funding for higher education, and yet you've seen the cost burden shift from the state to the student. Now, for about 30% of the students that we serve in the University of Louisiana system, TOPS covered most of that increase. But for the adult student, TOPS is not an option. So I think it's been less of a matter of focus from institutions on adult students, as it's just been an increase in the cost burden to go to college. That's why we got to have this policy environment that I'm talking about. You know, it's for us to increase tuition in Louisiana, it requires a 2/3 vote for the legislature. But there's another piece of that equation. For us to decrease tuition, we don't even have that authority. And so say that I'm running a community college that's full from 8 o'clock in the morning until 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The reason I'm saying this is because I ran a community college. It was full from 8 o'clock in the morning until 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And then we fill up again at 6 o'clock in the evening until 9 at night. I would love to have the ability to price our product from 1 o'clock to 5 o'clock at half price and bring our most attractive professors, and I'm not physically attractive, but those that actually deliver education in a way that's meaningful to students, and put them in the classroom from 1 to 5. And imagine how I could shift that enrollment mix and bring people into the classroom. That's the kind of flexibility that we've got to provide our institutions if they're going to serve these underserved populations and these markets that are more difficult to serve. I think the increased cost of education has put a burden on adults, especially single working parents, that is going to be hard for us to recover from, but I promise if we're going to be competitive, we've got to figure that out. We talk about workforce development quite often, but think about this factor. In the year 2025, 80% of the workforce we're going to have then is in the workforce today. And so we can focus on this emerging population If we don't do something for that existing population that's been neglected for decades, we're not going to be able to realize our goals. Thank you for the question. So the question was, we want to focus on outcomes, and how can we do that? And to quote the questioner, with a pathetically low graduation rate. I think you've seen graduation rates at all universities increase over the last decade at a rate that exceeds that of most of the country. And you also have to understand what a graduation rate is. We think of graduation rates quite often with high schools. But you got to realize a high school has a captive population, so that you have students that have mandated attendance and to graduate. So that's one graduation rate, but it puts a number out there against which colleges and universities are often compared. When we went to selective admissions in 2004, the idea was that if we fill universities with students that have demonstrated preparedness for university life, we'd increase graduation rates. I think that that's part of the reason why we've seen some increases, but more importantly, I think it's because colleges and universities have gotten better at understanding the students they're serving, and that's why you've seen some dramatic increases in graduation rates. I think pathetically low is probably a description of where we were 15 years ago. I don't think it's a description of where we are today. I think you're seeing extraordinary advances in success of students, but the biggest threat to student success and to higher graduation rates is that increased cost burden on the backs of students. We have students that we serve, especially at some of our regional institutions, especially at some of our rural institutions, that are literally a dead car battery away from becoming a statistic and dropping out of college. We've got to solve that problem, and then you'll see graduation rates and retention rates increase even more than they have, which has been a pretty steady rate of improvement. So the questioner asked me to explain what graduation rates are based on, and it is important that you understand that graduation rates are focused on a small portion of the student population. So a graduation rate is what percent of the first-time full-time freshman cohort of a certain year graduated within 150% of the time for completion. So for a four-year degree, a traditional four-year degree, it's what percent of that first-time full-time freshman class graduated within 6 years. Again, referencing when I was at Bossier Parish Community College, the last year I was there, we graduated, I believe it was about 1,400 students. 102 of them counted toward the graduation rate. That means, if I'm doing my math right at the microphone, that's 1,298 students that graduated but didn't count toward the rate, because they didn't start with us as first-time freshmen. Or they may have started with us as a freshman year and decided to work 2 years offshore because there was a boom in the oil market, and then come back. All of a sudden, those become statistics. The graduation rate is an important measure, and if you have a graduation rate of 50%, that's fairly high, especially among regional institutions. But I think you ought to ask yourself what happened to that other 50%, and understand, were they 50% that left because they were pursuing other opportunities, or because there was a boom in the employment market and they could go make some money? You need to understand that. The graduation rates are important. They're certainly not the all-encompassing measure of success. I think that measure of success is how many graduates do you produce, and how successful are they after they leave your doors.
Thank you. I think that's all.
Listen, thank you all very, very much. I greatly appreciate the time.
Dr. Henderson, tell us, what's your message here today?
Well, it's about how the 9 universities of Louisiana are dedicated to producing a new future for Louisiana, one that is about economic competitiveness, one that's about quality of life for our citizenry, one that's about enriching our communities. We're going to produce the most educated generation in Louisiana's history, and we'll all benefit from it.
You mentioned 150,000 new graduates. Tell us about that.
You know, our presidents came together and developed a plan that I think is worthy of our system, worthy of the rich history of our institutions. They said that we're going to produce 150,000 new graduates who are prepared for jobs, who are prepared for careers, who are prepared for life by the year 2025. That's about a 20% increase in our previous year's productions. When we reach that, we'll start to reach a level of educational attainment that makes Louisiana competitive.
What will it take to get there?
It's going to take some innovation. It's going to take continued hard work by our faculty. It's going to take our institutions making new investments in those faculty. It means we're going to have to find out how to serve more populations, underserved populations, first-generation students, people that we have neglected for far too long, and that's when we're going to see the greatest return on the investment.
A key component, of course, is funding for higher education. Where does Louisiana rank compared to other southern states?
When you look at the 16 Southern Region Education Board states, we rank 16th out of the 16 in total resources available per student. We've got to figure out how we're going to make a new investment in colleges and universities. More importantly, how we're going to make a new investment in the students that we serve. It's vitally important for our future.
You made a specific reference to comparison between Louisiana and Florida.
Yeah, you know, I was looking at Florida, and quite often we're compared to Florida, be this the number of institutions or the cost and so on. And I said, you know, one of the comparisons to Florida to me should be just look back to 1960, when Florida had 8 members of Congress, Louisiana had 8 members of Congress. Today we have 6. Florida's got 27. What are the policy decisions and investments the state of Florida made that led to that great growth in population, that growth in their economy? Those are the kinds of things where we should emulate other states. Instead, I think we should really focus more on creating a policy environment where the colleges and universities of Louisiana can pair the generation that's going to make us competitive in the 21st century.
What would you like people to keep in mind about the value of higher education in Louisiana?
That in this era of constant change, of increased automation, the emergence of artificial intelligence, that we have to have a workforce that can think critically, that can solve problems, that can communicate effectively, that has been developed. We have to develop talent if we're going to be competitive. And when we do, not if we do, but when we do, you're going to see a quality of life in Louisiana that's eluded us for generations.
If people have questions like more information about the University of Louisiana system, what should they do?
Well, they can either follow me on Twitter at Dr. J.B. Henderson, or they can go to our website, ulsystem.edu.